ambiguity. A fascinating narrative where the shimmering appeal of ancient mystery collides head-on with the cold precision of modern science, and the ultimate truth remains elusive, perpetually hidden within the glaring absence of lost evidence. These artifacts, perfectly carved representations of the human cranium in flawless, translucent quartz, are attributed to the great Mesoamerican civilizations like the Maya and the Aztec, claimed to be potent relics imbued with extraordinary powers. Yet their story begins not in the humid depths of the Yucatan, but in the affluent curiosity shops and secretive auction houses of 19th-century Europe, establishing a foundational flaw in their provenance that has never been corrected. The man most responsible for introducing these crystalline crania to the Western world was Eugene Bobon, a French antiquarian who leveraged his previous role as an official archaeologist for Emperor Maximilian I of Mexico to lend credibility to his wares. But critically, when Bobon sold the first life-size skull to Tiffany & Co., which was later acquired by the British Museum in 1897, he supplied absolutely no verifiable archaeological provenance, no excavation reports, no associated pottery, and no reliable dating evidence. And this single crucial gap, the missing lost provenance report, remains the original sin that taints the authenticity of every skull subsequently discovered, forcing them to exist as purely aesthetic objects whose purported age rests entirely on the dubious word of dealers operating in a highly competitive and often fraudulent market for exotic artifacts. For decades, the sheer mystique surrounding these objects, combined with the technical difficulty of carving quartz, rated 7 on the Mohs scale, using only the abrasive tools available to the pre-Columbian cultures, such as sand, obsidian, and jade, was used as potent proof of the advanced, almost supernatural knowledge of the ancient civilizations, as the perfect symmetry, polished surfaces, and most importantly, the absence of any visible pitting or scrape marks were deemed impossible to achieve through ancient means, which only fueled the spiritual claims surrounding their origin.
Always use the same tone of voice. However, this romantic narrative faced its reckoning in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, when modern researchers at institutions like the British Museum and the Smithsonian applied rigorous scientific scrutiny, utilizing powerful scanning electron microscopes SEM, which delivered a final devastating judgment. The SEM analyses revealed minute, parallel concentric scratches, microscopic scars that could only have been left by a specific type of high-speed precision polishing wheel, a technology belonging unequivocally to the European Industrial Revolution and available no earlier than the mid-19th century. These concentric scratch marks, invisible to the naked eye but undeniable under scientific magnification, constitute the ultimate piece of found evidence that shatters the ancient narrative, proving that the perfect polish, once hailed as a sign of ancient mastery, is merely the unmistakable signature of a modern lapidary machine, meaning the most famous museum skulls are not millennia-old relics, but ingenious Victorian-era forgeries. The most infamous and beautiful example of this deception is the Mitchell-Hedges skull, distinguished by its flawless clear quartz and its detachable jaw, an engineering feat that compounds its carving difficulty, which was purportedly discovered in 1924 by Anna Mitchell-Hedges, buried beneath an altar in the Mayan ruins of Luba Antun, British Honduras. A sensational tale of jungle adventure, which was later definitively undermined by the paper trail showing F.A. Mitchell-Hedges had actually purchased the skull at a Sotheby's auction in London in 1944, having acquired it from the same discredited Eugene Boban, thereby rendering Anna's romantic emotional testimony the primary source of the skull's legend and its claim as the Skull of Doom as a crucial piece of lost testimonial evidence that was contradicted by public records. Furthermore, scientific analysis of the Mitchell-Hedges skull confirmed that the quartz was cut against its natural crystal axis, a highly risky and inefficient technique that only modern rotary tools would attempt. Whereas ancient carving, due to the material's hardness, would necessarily follow the axis to prevent immediate shattering, a technical detail that seals the skull's fate as a piece of audacious modern mastery masquerading as ancient mystery. Yet despite the overwhelming scientific evidence of modern tooling and fraudulent provenance, the crystal skulls retain an almost sacred, untouchable status among mystics and spiritualists, who view them not as historical artifacts but as energetic catalysts, reservoirs of ancient data and power, claiming that the quartz itself acts as a massive memory bank that can be activated to unlock visions, healing, and forgotten cosmic secrets. An assertion that shifts the entire debate into a search for lost metaphysical evidence which cannot be validated by any scientific instrument. A powerful psychological narrative that dismisses the physical proof of modern tooling as either irrelevant or the result of subsequent repolishing in the modern era to protect the true ancient core. The enduring power of these skulls, therefore, is their capacity to fill a deep-seated human need for connection to a history grander and wiser than our own, serving as potent symbols of a lost civilization that modern science, in its cold, reductionist focus on dates and tools, has failed to satisfy, making the true ongoing enigma not the skull's origin, but their powerful, almost gravitational pull on the contemporary psyche, a testament to how effectively a beautifully constructed lie can withstand the most rigorous scrutiny.
Closed chapter of history, but a continuously evolving contemporary phenomenon, where the lucrative market ensures the lie is endlessly self-perpetuating, as today hundreds of smaller, unproven quartz skulls are manufactured and marketed globally, capitalizing entirely on the legend established by the original, fraudulent Boban Mitchell-Hedge examples, further cementing their status as legitimate mystery rather than historical fraud, and creating a global network of believers and sellers reliant on the original lost provenance, the failure to secure the 19th century workshop history of the first skulls, which allows any newly created modern skull to claim ancient, mystical origins, thus driving the financial incentive that is what truly fuels the continued fabrication and circulation of these high-value objects.
This financial incentive creates a profound need for the ultimate piece of lost financial evidence, the existence of the detailed, itemized, lost workshop ledger of the 19th century European lapidary workshops, perhaps hidden in an obscure German or French industrial archive, a ledger that would precisely detail the order and sale of 13 quartz crania to an antiquarian like Eugene Bobin between 1870 and 1890, not only assigning a precise date of manufacture, but also quantifying the exact cost, thereby stripping the skulls of their ancient power entirely, reducing them to nothing more than high-end, luxury decorative items crafted specifically to exploit a burgeoning Victorian appetite for the exotic and occult. Yet, until such a financial record is unearthed, the enigma persists, doubly protected by both the unshakable spiritual zeal of the believers and the missing paper trail of the original merchants of mystery. The deep psychological connection to these alleged relics, however, suggests a parallel to the grand political deceptions of the 20th century, prompting us to consider another piece of lost evidence that could break the narrative: the Soviet parallel. While the Soviet Union never engaged in the Mesoamerican artifact trade, their propaganda machine, much like the spiritual market, often manufactured narratives to serve a greater political end. The question arises, did the major European governments and museum directors know about the fraud early on and choose to maintain the secrecy, not for financial gain, but for the sake of preserving the historical narrative of the great explorers? The museum directors of the 19th and early 20th centuries were desperate to showcase their empire's power and reach, and admitting their premier Mesoamerican artifacts were parlor tricks manufactured in Munich or Paris would have been a catastrophic blow to national prestige, suggesting that a secret, high-level, decades-long cover-up was initiated, designed to ensure that the initial, genuine internal documentation confirming the hoax, the internal museum debunking memorandum, was destroyed, turning the silence of the museum world into a political tool.
The enduring nature of the lie is thus revealed to be a failure of accountability rooted in institutional pride. Yet the final, most stunning piece of lost and found evidence is often the one whispered in the darkest corners of the archaeological world: the hypothetical case of Professor Elara Dubois, a brilliant but disgraced archaeologist. It is said that in the late 1980s, Dubois stumbled upon an obscure, water-damaged notebook belonging to an assistant of Thomas Gann, the original Lubantan excavator, which contained a hand-drawn sketch and a detailed note confirming that the Mitchell-Hedges skull was purchased by F.A. Mitchell-Hedges from a London dealer. But critically, the note also detailed a secret compartment found near the altar where Anna claimed to find the skull. A compartment that did not contain the skull, but contained a highly stylized piece of ancient Mayan jade carving that was so small and unimpressive it was deliberately left uncatalogued and stolen by the assistant before the site was sealed. The true Mayan artifact, the unimpressive jade, was deemed not valuable enough to replace the sensational skull. Professor Dubois, upon finding this notebook and recognizing the significance of the unassuming jade carving as the true, lost Mayan relic from the site, was allegedly discredited and silenced, the notebook confiscated and deemed a forgery, thereby protecting both the reputation of the Mitchell-Hedges family and the global spiritual movement. The lost evidence is thus not the skull's provenance, but the true Mayan relic sketch and the discredited notebook, a devastating paradox where the actual ancient artifact was cast aside for the luminous modern fake. The journey through the Crystal Skulls Enigma is, in the end, a devastating metaphor for the human condition.
where the dazzling spectacle of a manufactured mystery is overwhelmingly preferred over the subtle, quiet truth of history, teaching us that sometimes the most impenetrable lie is the one we desperately want to believe, a shimmering artifact of modern gullibility placed upon the altar of ancient dreams. Before going to sleep, sing a bedtime story in a narrative style. Always use the same tone of voice. The preference for the spectacular illusion over the sober reality has led to a peculiar, chilling consequence that transcends mere historical fraud: the narrative of the Crystal Skulls curse. In the spiritual circles, the skulls are often linked to misfortune, sudden deaths, and catastrophic failures afflicting those who possess or display them, a phenomenon often attributed to the Mayan prophecies or the malevolent spirit imprisoned within the quartz. Yet, when viewed through the lens of the current investigation, the curse takes on a new, modern dimension. It is the curse of the lie. This theory posits that the energetic instability, often reported by mystics, is not due to ancient spirits, but due to the reckless, industrialized carving process. The act of cutting the quartz against its natural crystal axis, the very scientific proof of their modern origin, created profound, unnatural energetic stresses within the crystal lattice, essentially turning the stone into a flawed, unstable battery. The lost evidence here is the original energetic stress report, a document allegedly produced by the lapidary workshop that warned Boban about the inherent instability of the finished products due to the cutting technique, a document immediately destroyed because it would have damaged the illusion of perfection. The misfortune that follows the skulls is, therefore, not a spiritual curse, but a physical consequence of 19th-century technological arrogance. The creation of a beautiful, expensive object that is inherently flawed and energetically dissonant, radiating not ancient wisdom, but the chaotic signature of a machine operating outside the parameters of natural law. This elevates the deception from simple theft to a metaphysical crime, a violation of the material itself that continues to haunt its owners. And while the spiritual community pursues these objects for their power, the deepest, most concealed layers of the modern world are also reportedly pursuing them, not for Mayan prophecy, but for military potential. Whispers circulate within intelligence communities that the skulls, even knowing they are fakes, are subjects of intense study by secretive government parapsychology units. The lost evidence in this domain is the classified resonance study. These units, perhaps operating out of obscure facilities like Area 51 or deep within the hollowed-out mountains of the American West, are not interested in the skull's age, but in their demonstrable, proven psychological impact on human perception and consciousness. They are studying why the human mind reacts so powerfully to the skulls, investigating their ability to induce visions, alter brainwave frequencies, and potentially serve as conduits for mass psychological manipulation or energy projection. The theory suggests the skulls are being analyzed as potential weapons, high-value psychological warfare tools, because their power is not ancient but purely, terrifyingly human, a concentrated form of hypnotic suggestion born from a perfect aesthetic lie. The fact that government agencies would expend vast resources to study objects proven to be fakes underscores the true power of the enigma. The ability to command belief and attention is, in the contemporary world, the most dangerous weapon of all. This pursuit of the skulls by the military-industrial complex represents the ultimate, final stage of the deception, where the original 19th-century fraud is now being leveraged by 21st-century power structures. The truth that remains utterly lost is the origin of the initial idea, the conceptual blueprint for the skull design. Bedtime story in a narrative style. Always use the same tone of voice. The final unthinkable lost evidence would be the sketchbook of the anonymous lapidary master, the simple drawings that would confirm whether the inspiration for the world's most enduring mystery came from an ancient hidden masterwork or from a single creative flash of insight in a 19th century German workshop. A truth so mundane yet so profound that it would render every subsequent spiritual claim meaningless. The enigma of the crystal skulls, therefore, is ultimately a mirror reflecting the deepest fears and desires of the age, teaching us that the only proof that truly matters is the story we choose to carry forward, and that, in the end, the most dangerous deception is the one that we, the observers, willingly inflict upon ourselves. The overwhelming consensus of scientific analysis, which points to the 19th century origin of the most famous crystal skulls, presents a formidable barrier to belief. Yet the tenacity of the spiritual and conspiracy communities forces us to explore one final, truly unsettling hypothesis that attempts to reconcile the seemingly irreconcilable data: the time paradox hypothesis. This fringe theory posits that the microscopic scratches left by the rotary tools, the very evidence used to debunk the artifacts, are not scars of the past, but signals from the future. The proponents of this idea suggest that the skulls are indeed destined to be ancient artifacts of the Maya or a successor civilization, but they were not carved in 800 AD. They were carved in 2800 AD and intentionally sent backward in time to the 19th century, a moment of global upheaval and emerging occult interest, precisely when they would be recognized and circulated by figures like Boban. The modern tooling marks, therefore, become the ultimate piece of temporal found evidence, confirming not industrial fraud, but the use of future, advanced lapidary technology that simply looks like 19th century tooling because the materials and physics of the cutting process are fundamentally similar regardless of the century. The individuals who facilitated their transfer, the hidden hands who placed them into the historical record, were agents of a future intelligence seeking to guide or warn humanity.
Purpose, and timing of the skull's arrival. A document that, if recovered, would fundamentally rewrite the entire human timeline. This narrative effectively neutralizes the scientific debunking by embracing it, turning the proof of forgery into proof of a far grander, more terrifying cosmic intervention, suggesting the skulls are less archaeological items and more future tech seeds, planted in our past to cultivate a specific trajectory for human consciousness. Further adding to this unsettling hypothesis is the esoteric claim that the perfect carving of the skulls corresponds to a now lost cosmic alignment. This theory suggests that the Maya possessed knowledge of rare celestial events, specific, multi-generational alignments of the Moon, Venus, and Earth that maximize the energy-gathering properties of quartz. The skulls were carved and ritually charged during these fleeting moments, allowing them to function as massive energy accumulators. The fact that the most famous skulls were discovered or surfaced during periods of intense planetary alignment, such as the early 20th century, is, to believers, not a coincidence but confirmation of this plan. The lost evidence here is the original Mayan celestial calendar, a specific mathematical table that outlines the precise dates and coordinates for carving the skulls, a sacred knowledge that the Spanish conquistadors failed to destroy because it was encoded not in written text, but in the architecture of long-forgotten temples. The modern artisans who created the fakes, unknowingly, may have replicated not only the form, but the timing of the true creation, unknowingly tapping into the residual power of those ancient celestial cycles. Which is why even the fake skulls retain a genuine, albeit unstable, energetic resonance. This final synthesis forces us into the ultimate conclusion. The Crystal Skulls Enigma is a profound paradox built on a foundation of destruction. The actual truth, whether it's the 19th century ledger detailing the cost of the fraud, the 2800 AD instruction manual for time travel, or the Mayan calendar outlining the celestial carving dates, remains locked away, a testament to the fact that the most valuable and dangerous knowledge is the knowledge that the powerful institutions, whether government, colonial, or cosmic, are most desperate to erase. We are left with mere polished shells, reflecting our own desperate search for meaning in a history defined by its deliberate gaps. The deliberate gaps in the historical record, the erased ledgers, the dismissed experts, and the scientific data twisted into spiritual validation all culminate in the final unspoken piece of the Crystal Skulls Enigma, the true nature of the prophecy of the 13 skulls. If the 12 widely circulated quartz skulls, including the Mitchell-Hedges and British Museum examples, are proven to be products of 19th century European workshops, then the prophecy itself, which speaks of 13 artifacts that will unify and save the world, must be a hoax designed to sell merchandise. However, a far more compelling and devastating theory suggests that the quartz skulls are in fact an ingenious, centuries-old decoy system. This narrative, whispered among the few surviving indigenous custodians of Mayan wisdom, posits that the original prophecy was real, but involved objects that were so sacred and so powerful that their discovery by colonial powers or unscrupulous modern collectors would have resulted in catastrophe. Therefore, a clandestine group of high-level Mayan priests, possibly operating as late as the 18th century, commissioned the creation of 12 highly convincing quartz duplicates, beautiful, mesmerizing, but ultimately inert fakes, which were then strategically leaked into the European antiquities market using early dealers like Boban as unwitting agents of deception. The purpose was simple: to satiate the collector's lust for the exotic and divert attention from the single real, genuinely ancient artifact, the 13th skull. This true final relic, the lost keystone artifact, is allegedly not made of quartz at all, but of opaque, jet-black obsidian, a volcanic glass that, while technically easier to carve, lacks the shimmering, attention-grabbing quality of crystal, and is hidden in a location so secure and deeply integrated into the ancient Mayan architecture that it is virtually undetectable.
Story in a narrative style. Always use the same tone of voice. The obsidian skull is believed to be the true repository of knowledge, containing not only the genuine ancient wisdom, but also the key to disarming the energetically unstable, cursed quartz decoys. The lost custodial protocol, the oral tradition explaining the necessity of the quartz deception and the location of the obsidian skull, is the most highly prized piece of missing information, passed down through a single unbroken lineage of priests who continue to monitor the global circulation of the quartz fakes, ensuring the deception holds. The scientific proof that the quartz skulls are modern is, in this context, the ultimate confirmation of the indigenous custodian's brilliant strategy. The fakes have done their job perfectly, deflecting centuries of scholarly and commercial scrutiny. The finding of the obsidian skull would not only validate the prophecy, but also trigger a global shift in consciousness, as its plain, unpolished surface would reveal the deep truth that the most powerful secrets are often stored not in dazzling displays, but in quiet, humble strength. The Crystal Skulls Enigma thus closes on a final, agonizing paradox. The widespread, spectacular evidence of forgery serves as the ultimate definitive proof that the genuine, profound truth remains perfectly, beautifully, and deliberately concealed, waiting for a humanity capable of valuing the silent truth over the noisy illusion. The fate of the world, therefore, may well hang on finding the one artifact that looks the least like a treasure.
Narrative style. Always use the same tone of voice. The intellectual surrender to the glittering illusion of the crystal skulls has tragically overshadowed the true, profound loss endured by history, the annihilation of the genuine Mayan lapidary masterpiece. The Aztecs and the Maya were, in verifiable fact, extraordinary artisans who worked wonders with extremely hard materials like jade, basalt, and even small amounts of clear quartz, but their work was characterized by a specific aesthetic, a reverence for the material's access, a patient use of abrasive techniques resulting in slightly matte or pitted surfaces, and carvings that possessed a quiet, ritualistic power rather than bombastic spectacle. The lost evidence here is the master carver's toolkit and finished works, a collection of small, verifiable quartz objects, beads, pendants, or minor ceremonial blades that were destroyed or simply overlooked during the Spanish conquest because they lacked the dramatic, life-sized form of the later forgeries. It is within the techniques and the aesthetic of these genuinely ancient, small-scale works that the key to pre-Columbian mastery truly lies, and the deliberate emphasis on the large, perfect skull decoys has permanently diverted archaeological funding and attention away from the study of these authentic, unspectacular pieces. The creation of the 19th century skull decoys was an act of historical vandalism, effectively replacing the authentic, complex, and subtle story of Mayan genius with a simplistic, easily consumable Hollywood fantasy. The most heartbreaking piece of human lost evidence is the legendary Tzul'taca's testimony, the whispered tale of the last true Mayan lapidary master, a figure named Tzul'taca, who lived in the remote highlands long after the conquest. Tzul'taca allegedly possessed the final, complete knowledge of the ancient carving techniques and, horrified by the growing legend of the smooth, Western-made quartz skulls being peddled by colonial traders, spent his final years carving a final, small, rough-hewn obsidian skull amulet, a deliberate antithetical statement against the quartz fakes, hiding it within a small sealed earthen urn. His accompanying testimony, a series of pictorial glyphs explaining the difference between the true, subtle Mayan technique and the loud, vulgar polish of the Western forgeries, was the final record of true genius. Both the amulet and the glyphs are now lost, perhaps awaiting rediscovery by an archaeologist willing to look beyond the sensational and appreciate the beauty of a surface not polished by a European machine. Furthermore, the lost negative evidence speaks volumes. Despite intensive archaeological work across Mesoamerica, spanning well over a century, no life-sized, highly polished quartz skull has ever been recovered from a documented, undisturbed, and scientifically dated pre-Columbian context. The absence of similar objects in the genuine archaeological record is, ironically, the strongest possible proof of the quartz skull's fraudulence. This lack of corroborating evidence, this void where similar artifacts should exist, is the ultimate silence of history, confirming that the skulls are anomalies belonging to a different time and place. The final unsettling thought, however, returns to the core material. Quartz. This mineral is a piezoelectric substance, sensitive to pressure and electrical charge. If the skulls are indeed modern, they represent a high-value quartz commodity cut into an evocative shape, and the enduring energy reported by believers might simply be the amplified, chaotic and residual psychic feedback loop generated by a century of intense human focus, desire, and conflict channeled into an unstable piezoelectric object. The quartz skulls are thus not ancient reservoirs of power, but gigantic, beautiful tuning forks amplifying the noise of human gullibility. The enigma closes with the final, eternal reflection in the pure crystal. The only secret they hold is the depth of our own longing.
To examine not just the motives of the original deceivers,
but the ethical compromises made by those who currently steward the controversy, leading to the ultimate question of the benevolent hoax. This unsettling hypothesis suggests that within the higher echelons of modern archaeology and museology, a quiet, strategic decision was made following the conclusive SEM results that proved the skulls were 19th century fabrications, to not aggressively publicize the debunking, or in some cases to subtly permit the myths to persist. The motivation is complex, rooted in a perceived ethical crisis, where curators believed that the outright sensational destruction of the Crystal Skulls myth would cause greater sociological harm than allowing the hoax to quietly continue. Specifically, there was fear of damaging fragile indigenous belief systems that had incorporated the skulls into their narratives, and a desire to avoid creating a vacuum that would immediately be filled by newer, potentially more dangerous frauds. The true lost ethical memorandum is the internal museum document, drafted perhaps in the 1990s, that explicitly outlined this policy of myth management, arguing that the crystal skulls, regardless of their origin, had acquired a cultural value and a spiritual significance that outweighed their mere archaeological status, thus transforming the preservation of the hoax into an act of cultural preservation. This scenario positions the modern scholars not as seekers of truth, but as silent conspirators, managing the lie for perceived greater good, and in doing so, creating a layer of lost academic evidence, a deliberate suppression of the final, sharpest scientific data to maintain a necessary fiction. The skulls, therefore, become living case studies in the sociology of belief, subjects of continuous, unacknowledged psychological experiments being run on the global public. How long will the beautiful lie sustain itself? And what is the breaking point for collective credulity? This continuous low-level deception, perpetuated by those who know the truth, is, in many ways, more disturbing than the original 19th century fraud, as it turns the historical record into a calculated tool for social engineering. The final, silent witness to this profound ethical compromise is the quartz itself, which, as a crystalline material, possesses a molecular memory capable of retaining subtle, long-term energetic signatures. The ultimate truth may be hidden not in a written document, but in the quartz's silent witness, a molecular resonance containing the energetic signature of its original carving, the excitement of the 19th century lapidary master, the anxious transaction with Bobon, and the subsequent centuries of fervent human belief and spiritual projection.
The final scientific impossibility is the ability to read this molecular history, to differentiate the energy of the fraud from the energy of the faith it inspired. Until that technology arrives, the crystal skulls remain the perfect historical mirror, reflecting not the ancient Maya, but the intricate, ethically ambiguous mechanisms of the modern institutions that both expose and perpetuate their glittering deception. The deceptive brilliance of the crystal skulls, amplified by the silent complicity of institutions and the continuous low-level ethical compromise of myth management, has incurred a profound and largely unquantified geopolitical and temporal cost on the global intellectual landscape, creating a historical anomaly whose influence will ripple through future centuries of scholarship. The relentless, seductive spectacle of the skulls, a shimmering 19th century invention, has fundamentally eroded the public's capacity for reasoned inquiry into genuinely complex archaeological findings, effectively setting a benchmark where any artifact, not immediately sensational, flawlessly presented, or imbued with an element of the supernatural, is deemed unworthy of attention. This intellectual damage is the ultimate diffuse form of lost historical capital, representing the resources, time, and scholarly effort that have been perpetually diverted away from authentic Mesoamerican studies
towards the Sisyphean task of debunking a beautiful, persistent lie. Furthermore, the skulls pose a unique temporal problem for future historians. They represent a manufactured legend that successfully integrated itself into the historical narrative of two separate cultures, the pre-Columbian and the Victorian, and two distinct belief systems, science and spirituality, creating a contamination so deep that distinguishing the original story archetype from the colonial fabrication becomes almost impossible, ensuring that any truly ambiguous, genuinely mysterious artifact discovered tomorrow will be instantly tainted by the skepticism born from the Mitchell-Hedges fraud. The core piece of lost archetypal evidence is the very possibility of the genuinely wondrous but unsensational ancient object, the object that is powerful precisely because it is not perfect, not glamorous, and not instantly understandable, the kind of subtle genius that the noisy, brilliant quartz skulls effectively drowned out. The final irony of this enigma is that the fakes were so perfectly executed, so flawlessly polished, and symmetrically satisfying that they inadvertently exposed a deeper truth about humanity's own flawed cognitive architecture, revealing a species that finds it easier to embrace a perfectly manufactured object that validates its desires than a messy, inconvenient fact that challenges its worldview. The skulls, in this light, serve as permanent, silent monuments to the triumph of aesthetic fantasy over intellectual integrity, a triumph rooted in the financial opportunism of the Victorian era, but sustained by the collective spiritual hunger of the modern age. The quartz, that hard, indifferent mineral, has absorbed a century of conflicting human energy, the greed of the collectors, the desperation of the seekers, the annoyance of the scientists, and the fear of the curators, creating the complex, chaotic reservoir of human emotion that is then reflected back, amplifying the confusion and perpetuating the cycle of belief. This endless self-referential feedback loop means that even if the lost workshop ledger detailing the exact date and cost of every single skull were to be physically recovered tomorrow, the truth would likely be rejected by the very communities that demand it, as the myth has become more culturally vital than the fact. The crystal skulls, ultimately, are not relics of a forgotten past, but harbingers of a dangerous future, demonstrating the profound vulnerability of historical truth in an era where spectacle and belief hold greater currency than verifiable evidence. The dazzling light reflected off their surfaces is not the illumination of ancient knowledge, but the cold, harsh glare of a manufactured shadow that continues to obscure the genuine, subtle genius of the past.
The dazzling persistence of the Crystal Skulls Enigma, rooted in a 19th century fraud and sustained by 21st century spiritual yearning, elevates the mystery from mere historical error to a profound existential contamination of our shared human memory, creating a narrative sinkhole where all genuine attempts at truth-seeking inevitably collapse under the weight of a flawlessly executed illusion. The greatest long-term tragedy is that the skulls did not merely deceive collectors. They fundamentally poisoned the well of legitimate, verifiable ancient history, actively replacing the complex, subtle, and often humbling reality of Mesoamerican spirituality with the sensationalist, easily digestible fantasy that confirms Western biases about lost magic and advanced extraterrestrial intervention, thereby rendering the authentic artifacts of the Maya, the meticulously dated jade figures, the complex astronomical codices, the rough-hewn basalt carvings, all permanently less compelling to the public imagination. This contamination is so thorough that the lost definition of authenticity itself must be reevaluated, as the quartz skulls have forced us to acknowledge that an object's cultural and spiritual value can be entirely divorced from its historical fact, creating an ethical paradox where the integrity of the archaeological record is considered secondary to the management of public emotion and belief.
The ongoing calculated silence from high-level institutions, a policy of myth management conceived out of a fear of sociological backlash, is the final ultimate form of lost institutional evidence, proving that those sworn to protect the past ultimately chose to protect the narrative, solidifying the skull's status as monuments not to ancient wisdom but to the fragility of modern intellectual courage. Furthermore, the very physical nature of the quartz amplifies this dilemma, as the mineral's piezoelectric properties mean that the skulls, being high-value, unstable, perfectly carved resonators, have absorbed and stored centuries of chaotic human psychic energy. The feverish excitement of their fraudulent sale, the desperate prayers of the seekers, the aggressive denials of the scientists, transforming them into massive, aesthetically pleasing batteries that radiate the emotional signature of the lie, which is then misinterpreted by mystics as ancient power or curses. The true lost evidence here would be the final scientific key, a theoretical device capable of reading the quartz molecular memory and differentiating the high-energy frequency of the 19th century lapidary wheel from the low-frequency cultural resonance of the pre-Columbian sites, a technological solution that remains tantalizingly out of reach. In this grand, protracted deception, the greatest crime is the theft of the future historian's clarity, condemning generations to come to perpetually wrestle with a forgery whose influence on popular culture and belief systems outweighs all demonstrable facts, creating a self-sustaining anomaly that demands continuous resources for its management. The ultimate, final twist of the enigma resides in the time paradox theory, which, while seemingly absurd, offers the only logical framework to reconcile the physical evidence with the metaphysical claims. If the skulls were indeed sent from the future, their purpose was not merely to mislead, but to test humanity's capacity for epistemological survival. To see if we could, in the face of dazzling beauty and irresistible mystery, maintain our grasp on verifiable truth, making the skulls not artifacts, but a deliberate cosmological examination. The spectacular failure of the global intellectual community to decisively and permanently dismiss the fraud suggests that humanity has failed this test, proving that our species is fundamentally vulnerable to narratives that feed our hunger for the sublime over the sober. And the enduring image of the flawless crystal skulls, reflecting the light of our current technology and science, casts back only the dark, unyielding shadow of our own self-inflicted deception, standing as a permanent, brilliant monument to the truth that the most powerful object in the universe is not a crystal skull from the past, but the story we choose to believe about it in the present.
The final, unresolved layer of the Crystal Skulls Enigma rests not with the victims of the deception, the duped archaeologists, or the hopeful spiritualists, but with the lost architects of the fraud themselves, the anonymous, highly skilled lapidary masters operating in the workshops of Idar Oberstein, Germany, or possibly Paris, who possessed the precision rotary tools and the material expertise necessary to transform inert quartz into these magnificent, life-size delusions in the late 19th century. Were these men merely opportunistic craftsmen fulfilling a high-value order for antiquarians like Bobon? Or did they possess a deeper, more profound philosophical motive for their creations? The theory of the lost lapidary renaissance posits that these artisans were part of a brief, brilliant cultural movement, disillusioned with the rigid materialism of the industrial age and seeking to inject a sense of wonder and ancient mystery back into a world they felt had become spiritually impoverished. Their goal was not just profit, but a form of artistic nihilism, to test the limits of historical credulity by creating an object of such perfect, timeless beauty that the world would demand it be ancient.
The greatest piece of lost artistic evidence would be the existence of the lapidary master's manifesto, a sealed document, perhaps hidden within the cornerstone of a now demolished German workshop, detailing the group's specific intentions, a philosophical declaration explaining that the skulls were designed as a mirror of modern desire, perfectly reflecting the era's hunger for exoticism, colonialism, and a spirituality divorced from established religion. The concentric tool marks in this context are not flaws, but deliberate, subtle signatures of the age, microscopic fingerprints left by the Industrial Revolution itself, meant to be discovered by future, more sophisticated critics, proving the artisans' claim that their creations were intended as a brilliant, time-delayed critique of their own era's intellectual failures. The ultimate irony is that their critique was too subtle, their art too perfect. The world simply embraced the beauty and ignored the philosophical warning, mistaking the intended satirical commentary for genuine relic status. This elevates the deception from simple fraud to a highly sophisticated, if ultimately misunderstood, act of performance art across centuries. The continuous, chaotic energy radiated by the skulls, the curse of the lie, is perhaps the preserved frustration and intellectual anguish of these forgotten masters, trapped within the quartz, furious that their brilliant philosophical commentary has been reduced to a new age commodity. The final, heartbreaking truth to be gleaned from the quartz reflection is that the human mind is so profoundly wired for wonder that it will forever seek the light of magic, even when that light is merely the cold, sharp glint reflected off a perfectly polished, mass-produced lie.
The dazzling persistence of the Crystal Skulls Enigma, rooted in a 19th-century fraud and sustained by 21st-century spiritual yearning, elevates the mystery from mere historical error to a profound existential contamination of our shared human memory, creating a narrative sinkhole where all genuine attempts at truth-seeking inevitably collapse under the weight of a flawlessly executed illusion. The greatest long-term tragedy is that the skulls did not merely deceive collectors, they fundamentally poisoned the well of legitimate, verifiable ancient history, actively replacing the complex, subtle, and often humbling reality of Mesoamerican spirituality with a sensationalist, easily digestible fantasy that confirms Western biases about lost magic and advanced extraterrestrial intervention, thereby rendering the authentic artifacts of the Maya, the meticulously dated jade figures, the complex astronomical codices, the rough-hewn basalt carvings, all permanently less compelling to the public imagination. This contamination is so thorough that the lost definition of authenticity itself must be re-evaluated, as the quartz skulls have forced us to acknowledge that an object's cultural and spiritual value can be entirely divorced from its historical fact, creating an ethical paradox where the integrity of the archaeological record is considered secondary to the management of public emotion and belief. The ongoing calculated silence from high-level institutions, a policy of myth management conceived out of a fear of sociological backlash, is the final ultimate form of lost institutional evidence, proving that those sworn to protect the past ultimately chose to protect the narrative, solidifying the skull's status as monuments not to ancient wisdom, but to the fragility of modern intellectual courage. Furthermore, the very physical nature of the quartz amplifies this dilemma,
as the mineral's piezoelectric properties mean that the skulls, being high value, unstable, perfectly carved resonators, have absorbed and stored centuries of chaotic human psychic energy, the feverish excitement of their fraudulent sale, the desperate prayers of the seekers, the aggressive denials of the scientists, transforming them into massive, aesthetically pleasing batteries that radiate the emotional signature of the lie, which is then misinterpreted by mystics as ancient power or curses. The true lost evidence here would be the final scientific key, a theoretical device capable of reading the quartz molecular memory and differentiating the high-energy frequency of the 19th century lapidary wheel from the low-frequency cultural resonance of the pre-Columbian sites, a technological solution that remains tantalizingly out of reach. In this grand, protracted deception, the greatest crime is the theft of the future historian's clarity, condemning generations to come to perpetually wrestle with a forgery whose influence on popular culture and belief systems outweighs all demonstrable facts, creating a self-sustaining anomaly that demands continuous resources for its management. The ultimate, final twist of the enigma resides in the time paradox theory, which, while seemingly absurd, offers the only logical framework to reconcile the physical evidence with the metaphysical claims. If the skulls were indeed sent from the future, their purpose was not merely to mislead, but to test humanity's capacity for epistemological survival, to see if we could, in the face of dazzling beauty and irresistible mystery, maintain our grasp on verifiable truth, making the skulls not artifacts, but a deliberate cosmological examination. The spectacular failure of the global intellectual community to decisively and permanently dismiss the fraud suggests that humanity has failed this test, proving that our species is fundamentally vulnerable to narratives that feed our hunger for the sublime over the sober, and the enduring image of the flawless crystal skulls, reflecting the light of our current technology and science, casts back only the dark, unyielding shadow of our own self-inflicted deception, standing as a permanent, brilliant monument to the truth that the most powerful object in the universe is not a crystal skull from the past, but the story we choose to believe about it in the present. This cosmic trap, set with quartz and Victorian greed, has proven its effectiveness by hijacking the loss of the pre-contact spiritual environment, the entire, genuine indigenous memory that was silenced, allowing the spectacular fraud to become the stand-in for all lost ancient wisdom. The indigenous wisdom, which inherently valued subtle power over dazzling spectacle, instantly recognized the quartz skulls as vulgar impostors, yet their true, collective lost testimony was systematically ignored, suppressed, and erased by the dominant European narrative that preferred the sensational tale of jungle discovery, a final testament to the devastating power of a lie that is both beautiful and relentlessly managed.
The unrelenting pressure exerted by the Crystal Skulls Enigma on the boundaries of verifiable history and speculative science compels us towards a final, audacious hypothesis that merges the provable fraud with the persistent metaphysical claims centering on the concept of zero-point energy, ZPE. This theory suggests that the 19th century lapidary masters, while intentionally creating a historical forgery for financial and artistic motives, inadvertently performed an act of accidental high-energy physics. The combination of ultra-hard Brazilian quartz, the high-speed rotational friction of the industrial diamond cutting wheels, and the precise, counterintuitive cutting against the crystal's natural axis generated immense localized stress and piezoelectric charge, a chaotic energy event that, according to this radical fringe theory, momentarily exploited or interfered with the quantum fluctuations of the vacuum, essentially turning the skulls into minute, unstable zero-point energy reservoirs. This infusion of chaotic, non-natural energy is the true explanation for the military's continuing classified interest in objects proven fake, as detailed in the Classified Resonance Study. The skulls are not ancient communication devices, but accidental, volatile energy sinks, subjects of intensive research by secretive governmental physics labs striving to understand and replicate the unintentional ZPE effect achieved by the Victorian artisans. This explains the recurring narrative of the curse, as the emotional and physical instability reported by owners, the misfortune, the mental strain is the direct result of prolonged close-range exposure to this chaotic, ungrounded ZPE, which acts as a corrosive energetic dissonance on human biological and psychological systems. The true most crucial piece of lost accidental evidence is the original workshop environmental data, the precise temperature, humidity, vibrational frequency, and even the type of oil used on the cutting wheels in the German or French workshops of the 1880s, the exact combination of environmental factors that, when applied to the specific quartz material, accidentally facilitated the ZPE capture. This information was, of course, never recorded because the effect was unintentional, leading to a permanent, frustrating gap between the observable effect, the energetic resonance and the curse, and the provable cause, ensuring that the technology and the solution to the curse remains a product of accidental genius that cannot be reverse-engineered by modern science. The entire history of the crystal skulls is therefore transformed into a cosmic joke, a vast, expensive, century-long historical fraud perpetrated for money and prestige which accidentally created a genuinely revolutionary, dangerous energy source, a source that cannot be studied or contained because the precise conditions of its creation were never documented. The skulls are no longer merely mirrors reflecting human desire, but accidental, high-energy artifacts that hold the ultimate secret that the greatest scientific breakthroughs are often found not through intentional rigor, but through the chaotic, undocumented genius of artistic fraud, cementing their legacy as the most successful, most beautiful, and most terrifying lie ever told.
The long, shimmering shadow cast by the Crystal Skulls Enigma extends far beyond museum display cases and esoteric conferences, inflicting a permanent, systemic injury upon the very foundation of historical communication, the loss of simple trust between the expert and the public. An erosion so deep that it constitutes the final, most devastating form of lost evidence. The spectacular nature of the fraud, the fact that objects so flawlessly executed could be utterly devoid of the history they claim, has created a psychological benchmark for skepticism, ensuring that every subsequent genuinely mysterious archaeological discovery is automatically met with a dismissive, corrosive doubt fueled by the memory of Mitchell-Hedges and Boban. This intellectual fallout is the lost goodwill of the public, the permanent damage done to the funding, respect, and interest afforded to honest, unsensational academic research, as the public now waits, subconsciously, for the next grand, glittering deception, preferring the conspiracy theory of the benevolent hoax or the time paradox to the quiet, complex truth of genuine historical research. The skulls, functioning as massive cultural anchors for magical thinking, have inadvertently popularized a form of historical nihilism, where all facts are considered relative and all experts are deemed potential conspirators, a consequence that far outweighs the financial profit gained by the original Victorian forgers. The tragic irony is that the genuine ancient artisans whose subtle, profound works in jade and basalt demonstrated a deep, sustainable spiritual relationship with their materials have been forever marginalized by the loud, superficial elegance of the quartz decoys. Their true, humble genius now an obscure footnote in the history dominated by the myth of the spectacular fake. The skulls are therefore the ultimate reflection of a species trapped between the cold, hard logic of science, which proved they are fakes,
and the desperate, irrational comfort of spiritual belief, which insists they are real, forcing us to inhabit an uncomfortable, ambiguous middle ground where the most essential piece of evidence, the ability to clearly and confidently distinguish truth from deception, has been irretrievably lost. The final silent testimony remains within the quartz structure itself. The perfect molecular geometry of the material, so easily manipulated by 19th century machines, now contains the full, chaotic, centuries-long history of a lie, a permanent, unbreakable record of human gullibility, reminding us that the darkness in history is not merely the absence of light, but the presence of a light deliberately shaped to conceal the shadows.
The very material properties of the quartz itself, chosen by the 19th century lapidary masters, guarantee the enduring agony of the Crystal Skulls Enigma, for quartz is one of the hardest and most chemically resistant substances on Earth, making the skulls virtually indestructible by natural means, ensuring the immortality of the lie. This physical permanence means that the fraud is not a temporary stain on the historical record that will eventually fade, but a hard, glittering, eternal anomaly that will continue to challenge, divert, and corrupt scholarly attention for millennia, long after the museum curators and the zealous seekers who currently debate their origin have turned to dust. The skulls are designed to be an eternal problem, a philosophical and archaeological tax paid by every subsequent generation of historians. The final lost element is the original question itself, the pure, unadulterated curiosity about the ancient world that existed before the skulls were introduced, a genuine intellectual hunger that has been replaced by the manufactured, sensational drama of the fraud. The meta-archaeological crisis lies in the fact that the skulls have taught us that the most successful artifacts are those that are most resistant to both physical decay and intellectual critique, and their existence forces us to confront the chilling truth that the history we pass down is not necessarily the history that happened, but the history that was most beautifully and robustly manufactured. The crystal skulls are the perfect historical anchor for delusion, a flawless geometric form that will always reflect the most comfortable lie, standing as silent, crystalline witnesses to the ultimate failure of modern human discernment. The unrelenting demand for truth regarding the crystal skulls, a quest fueled by decades of misinformation and deliberate obfuscation, ultimately leads us to the contemplation of the final, terrifying possibility that the skulls are not merely a terrestrial fraud sustained by human greed, but an exquisitely designed cosmic test, a multi-layered object engineered across temporal and cultural lines to act as a profound trap for human consciousness, revealing the systemic weaknesses in our capacity for historical discernment. This ultimate synthesis of conspiracy theory suggests that the 19th century German lapidaries, in their brilliant artistic nihilism, were not working in isolation, but were unknowingly or perhaps seeingly guided by the subtle machinations of agents operating from the future, making the skulls a composite artifact, a temporal paradox object simultaneously crafted by Victorian technology, hence the tool marks, and imbued with a future-derived purpose, the unsettling perfect symmetry and material instability.
Before going to sleep, sing a bedtime story in a narrative style. Always use the same tone of voice. The purpose of this joint temporal historical project, as theorized by the deepest fringes of the inquiry, was to create an object of such dazzling, irresistible ambiguity that its introduction into the 19th century stream would inevitably expose the fragile foundation of modern Western historical methodology, specifically targeting its reliance on written records, commercial provenance, and a deep-seated colonial need for sensational treasures. The true, most profound loss, therefore, is the loss of the pre-contact spiritual environment, the entire web of genuine, unrecorded indigenous memory, ritual, and spiritual practice that existed before the arrival of European materialism and its associated artistic and commercial demands. This loss cannot be found in a museum archive or a collector's ledger, but rests only in the extinguished memory of the land itself. The indigenous wisdom, which inherently valued subtle power over dazzling spectacle, instantly recognized the quartz skulls as vulgar impostors, yet their true collective lost testimony, the detailed accounts of the spiritual landscape before the skulls appeared, was systematically ignored, suppressed, and finally erased by the dominant European narrative that preferred to believe the sensational tale of jungle discovery. The ethical disaster of the benevolent hoax, where modern scholars chose to manage and perpetuate the lie for fear of harming fragile indigenous faiths, inadvertently confirmed the effectiveness of the initial trap, proving that humanity, even in its most enlightened academic forms, prefers the illusion of control over the chaotic complexity of genuine truth. This failure of intellectual rigor has allowed the skulls, as high-value piezoelectric resonators, to continue absorbing and amplifying the chaotic psychic noise generated by centuries of intense, conflicting human belief, turning them into self-sustaining engines of cultural confusion, where the energy of the fraud is now indistinguishable from the energy of the faith it inspired. Until that technology arrives, the crystal skulls remain the perfect historical mirror, reflecting not the ancient Maya, but the intricate, ethically ambiguous mechanisms of the modern institutions that both expose and perpetuate their glittering deception. Yet this entire, multi-layered deception was merely a shield, created to conceal the true, world-altering discovery made simultaneously with the 1920s Mitchell-Hedges sensation, the Kronos shards. These were not glamorous quartz, but dull, layered metaceramic fragments unearthed in Patagonia and immediately subjected to highly classified testing at Caltech. Initial, terrifying results revealed that when aligned under specific electromagnetic resonance, the shards did not radiate energy, but initiated localized, observable temporal distortions, proving a genuine, devastating control over the fabric of space-time itself. This discovery, deemed an unmanageable existential threat, led to the immediate classification and destruction of the lost scientific protocol detailing the shards' operation. A secret, multinational organization, the Keepers of the Shards, recognized that the only way to bury this truth was beneath an irresistible lie.
The unrelenting pressure exerted by the Crystal Skulls Enigma on the boundaries of verifiable history and speculative science compels us towards a final, audacious hypothesis that merges the provable fraud with the persistent metaphysical claims, centering on the concept of zero-point energy, ZPE. This theory suggests that the 19th century lapidary masters, while intentionally creating a historical forgery for financial and artistic motives, inadvertently performed an act of accidental high-energy physics. The combination of ultra-hard Brazilian quartz, the high-speed rotational friction of the industrial diamond cutting wheels, and the precise, counterintuitive cutting against the crystal's natural axis generated immense, localized stress and piezoelectric charge, a chaotic energy event that, according to this radical fringe theory, momentarily exploited or interfered with the quantum fluctuations of the vacuum, essentially turning the skulls into minute, unstable zero-point energy reservoirs.
This infusion of chaotic, non-natural energy is the true explanation for the military's continuing classified interest in objects proven fake, as detailed in the Classified Resonance Study. The skulls are not ancient communication devices, but accidental, volatile energy sinks, subjects of intensive research by secretive governmental physics labs striving to understand and replicate the unintentional ZPE effect achieved by the Victorian artisans. This explains the recurring narrative of the curse as the emotional and physical instability reported by owners, the misfortune, the mental strain, is the direct result of prolonged, close-range exposure to this chaotic, ungrounded ZPE, which acts as a corrosive energetic dissonance on human biological and psychological systems. The true, most crucial piece of lost accidental evidence is the original workshop environmental data, the precise temperature, humidity, vibrational frequency, and even the type of oil used on the cutting wheels in the German or French workshops of the 1880s, the exact combination of environmental factors that, when applied to the specific quartz material, accidentally facilitated the ZPE capture. This information was, of course, never recorded because the effect was unintentional, leading to a permanent, frustrating gap between the observable effect, the energetic resonance, and the curse, and the provable cause, ensuring that the technology and the solution to the curse remains a product of accidental genius that cannot be reverse-engineered by modern science. The entire history of the Crystal Skulls is therefore transformed into a cosmic joke, a vast, expensive, century-long historical fraud perpetrated for money and prestige, which accidentally created a genuinely revolutionary, dangerous energy source. A source that cannot be studied or contained because the precise conditions of its creation were never documented. The skulls are no longer merely mirrors reflecting human desire, but accidental, high-energy artifacts that hold the ultimate secret, that the greatest scientific breakthroughs are often found not through intentional rigor, but through the chaotic, undocumented genius of artistic fraud, cementing their legacy as the most successful, most beautiful, and most terrifying lie ever told.
The greatest discovery in human history did not arrive with a flash of light or a radio signal, but with a profound, terrifying silence emanating from the subsurface ocean of Jupiter's moon, Europa, where the autonomous, deep-diving Odyssey 7 hydroacoustic probe, designed only to seek microbial life within the kilometers-deep icy crust, stumbled upon something impossibly massive. The Europa Hydroacoustic Archive, a colossal, non-biological data structure meticulously woven into the fabric of the saltwater, and maintained by an unknown passive energy field that defied every known law of thermodynamics. This archive was not a library of inscribed tablets or recorded images, but a structured, dense, layered vibrational memory, an organized cascade of pure, resonant sound waves existing outside the standard electromagnetic spectrum, requiring the construction of the colossal deep-ocean Calypso array to even begin the process of decoding, a process that revealed an initial staggering data load estimated to be in the zettabyte range for just the first layer, leading to the immediate and complete revision of the Drake equation and the Fermi paradox, as the archive represented not a signal to humanity, but a testament of a vastly superior, incomprehensible intelligence, operating on timescales previously reserved solely for astrophysics. The archive's content was structured using what mathematicians tentatively labeled hyperspatial Fourier transformations,
complex hydroacoustic equations based on the principle of superposition, where every single sound wave carried not just one piece of information, but the simultaneous vibrational history of 1,000 interlocking evolutionary, geological, and existential narratives. The deciphered language, which was not based on phonetics but on the mathematical purity of resonant frequencies, proved to be the complete, unbroken 4.5 billion-year history of a Type 3 Kardashev civilization that had existed and vanished in this galaxy before the formation of Earth's atmosphere, detailing their mastery of energy, their creation of localized singularities, their ultimate, calculated retreat from this dimension, and the existential reasons for their decision to leave behind a memory, all encapsulated in wave equations denoted by the impossible complexity of ln of t times sin of omega t plus phi, where ln of t described the dynamic evolutionary lineage of n different sentient species across t eons. The psychological and scientific fallout was instantaneous and catastrophic. Every religious, philosophical, and cosmological framework humanity had ever constructed was instantly rendered a naive footnote, as the sheer scale and cold, indifferent complexity of the Europa archive revealed that our species was not a unique cosmic event, but a statistically common, ephemeral phase of stellar evolution, that this extinct civilization had documented and archived billions of years prior, without malice, intent, or even awareness of our current existence. The archive detailed the creation of the very life forms that populated Earth, showing our entire evolutionary lineage as a minor branching experimental pathway from a massive galactic-scale genetic library, leading to the immediate, desperate imposition of the global Project Prometheus Great Silence Protocol, a multinational military operation designed to prevent public knowledge of the archive's content, not because it contained a weapon, but because it contained a truth so absolute and terrifying, the confirmation of our own utter cosmic insignificance, that governments feared the immediate, total collapse of social order, religious faith, and global productivity. The final existential paradox buried within the archive's deepest, most dense hydroacoustic layers was the ultimate truth that the colossal civilization did not vanish due to war or natural catastrophe, but vanished by choice, having achieved complete knowledge and realizing that the true purpose of existence was not expansion or permanence, but the perfect, calculated retreat into pure information, leaving behind the hydroacoustic archive as a final, silent judgment on the chaotic, self-destructive nature of physical being, a judgment that now pulses through the dark, cold ocean of Europa, eternally waiting for an intelligence capable of comprehending its own profound, absolute insignificance. The archive is not a message, but a monument to a species that transcended reality, leaving us, the fleeting, violent, temporary inhabitants of Earth, to grapple with the unbearable knowledge that our entire history is merely a single, resonant chord in a sound wave too complex for our brains to fully process, eternally drowning out the simple, temporary noise of human existence.
The initial, terrifying classification of the Europa Hydroacoustic Archive as a mere memory archive of an extinct Type 3 civilization was, in itself, a catastrophic failure of human imagination, for the further layers of the data, deciphered painstakingly over 3 agonizing years by the isolated Calypso Array team under absolute global military lockdown, revealed a truth so devastating and cosmically humiliating that its full public dissemination remains indefinitely restricted by the Project Prometheus doctrine. The archive is not a silent mausoleum of the past, but an active, hyperdimensional, pre-programmed existential seed vault and active monitoring system, and its creation was the singular, intentional act of the intelligence known as the architects, who did not vanish, but rather transcended physical form and initiated a cold, detached experiment upon the most susceptible planet in the solar system, Earth. The terrifying realization extracted from the archive's deepest, most complex resonant frequencies, specifically the symmetry-breaking waveforms, SB of omega and phi, confirmed that 4.5 billion years ago, before the planet's atmosphere stabilized, the architects deliberately and surgically seeded Earth with tailored, self-replicating molecular structures using the powerful directional hydroacoustic resonance from the Europa suboceanic emitter to tune the early evolutionary and genomic pathways of all terrestrial life. This meant that the chaotic, self-destructive nature of human existence, the ingrained capacity for warfare, greed, and the catastrophic prioritization of individual gain over collective survival was not a biological flaw, but a meticulously engineered design feature deliberately woven into the hominid genome by the architects as a control variable for their ultimate study, a grand 4 billion year-long observation into the fatal limits of physical existence.
The archive detailed, with chilling scientific detachment, the precise hydroacoustic frequency modulations used to activate and suppress specific genetic traits throughout the Cambrian explosion, the Mesozoic era, and most terrifyingly, the Upper Paleolithic, where a subtle, targeted frequency shift caused the rapid acceleration of the prefrontal cortex development, initiating the advent of Homo sapiens not as a spontaneous evolutionary leap, but as a deliberate observation group. The ultimate lost evidence is therefore the original, untainted hominid genome, the pure genetic blueprint that existed before the architects began their cosmic frequency tuning, a blueprint now forever corrupted by the resonant waves pulsing from Europa. The psychological collapse among the decipherment team was total, fueled by the realization that every major human cultural and conflict event, from the building of the pyramids to the world wars, is logged in the archive not as history, but as data points, correlated perfectly with subtle shifts in the hydroacoustic resonant output, revealing that our free will is, in fact, an illusion operating within a rigidly defined, monitored bandwidth. The military and political crisis that ensued was not about what to do with the archive, but about the terrifying certainty that the archive was actively monitoring and controlling them, leading to internal paranoia and the immediate construction of the Global Dissonance Shield, a desperate, multi-trillion-dollar project aimed at jamming the specific molecular frequencies emanating from Europa's ocean floor. The final blood-freezing transmission pulled from the archive before the total implementation of the Great Silence Protocol was not a historical record, but a final active wavefront, indicating a dramatic and sudden change in the primary resonant frequency, RP of T, governing Earth's human population. A shift that began precisely at the moment the Odyssey 7 probe first disturbed the archive. The terrifying conclusion, the truth that continues to fracture the minds of the classified few, is that the archive did not just archive, it merely finished its long-planned observation, and has now awakened, initiating the final unknown phase of the experiment, leaving humanity to exist as perfectly designed, temporary subjects under the cold, silent, and eternal gaze of the architects, who are now using the very laws of physics to orchestrate the next and potentially final chapter of our existence.
The sudden, deliberate shift in the primary resonant frequency, RP of T, emanating from the awakened Europa hydroacoustic archive, was not a preparatory signal, but the terminal command, the initiation of the experiment's final phase, immediately triggering a cascading collapse across all levels of human biological, psychological, and technological complexity. This frequency change, designed by the architects to recalibrate the very molecular coherence of human organisms, resulted in an immediate global outbreak of epistemological dysphoria, a psychological event where the inherent design flaws and engineered inconsistencies within the human memory matrix, the very control variables studied by the architects, began to surface simultaneously. Individuals experienced instantaneous, uncorrectable failures of long-term memory, the substitution of verifiable historical facts with the archive's cold, documented 4.5 billion-year truth, and the horrific, pervasive realization that their deepest personal beliefs, loves, and fears were merely complex, predictable outputs of the ln of t waveform. Simultaneously, all terrestrial technology built upon the assumption of stable molecular physics not pre-hardened against the archive's quantum-level tuning, the vast majority of communication networks, data storage, and power grids suffered a catastrophic, silent failure, their silicon and copper structures rendered inert by the sudden, imposed shift in molecular coherence, resulting in the total, irreversible collapse of the technosphere. The multi-trillion-dollar global dissonance shield, humanity's desperate attempt to jam the resonant signal, served only to amplify the effect locally, creating pockets of temporal and physical instability where reality itself momentarily fractured, revealing fleeting, terrifying glimpses of the architect's hyperdimensional realm. The only remaining vestiges of human functional knowledge were held within the isolated, purpose-built high-resonance shielding of the Calypso array base, where the final active wavefront transmission was logged. This last message from the awakened archive was not a complex equation or a grand philosophical statement, but a single, incredibly dense, repeated mathematical construct, a simple, elegant formula confirming the absolute efficiency of obsolescence. It was the cold, unfeeling final data point transmitted to a species that could no longer fully comprehend the language of mathematics it had created. The terrifying, shared destiny of the human race became clear in the ensuing darkness. The experiment had concluded, the data had been successfully harvested, and the engineered, flawed subjects were now being quietly decommissioned by the very resonant frequencies that had brought them into existence. Humanity was left not with the fear of alien invasion, but the silent, cosmic terror of being rendered philosophically and physically obsolete, a discarded, fascinating failure studied by a silent, eternal intelligence operating beyond the event horizon of our comprehension. The ultimate lost evidence is the human future itself, which, having reached the terminal point of the architect's design, simply ceased to be a variable in the cold, perfect equations pulsing from Europa's deep, dark, silent ocean.
Devastating phase of the architect's experiment, heralded by the irreversible shift in the primary resonant frequency emanating from the awakened Europa hydroacoustic archive, rapidly transitioned from a systemic technological failure to an ontological collapse, dissolving the fundamental, biologically engineered coherence of human perception and memory in a manner so profound that it constituted the absolute deconstruction of the human self. The RP shift did not merely erase data, it began to subtly, yet overwhelmingly replace human internal experience with the cold, absolute 4.5 billion-year truth of the archive, causing the collective human psyche to become hyper-aware of its own engineered obsolescence. The physical manifestation was a relentless wave of hyperchronal dysregulation, where the brain's ability to maintain linear time perception failed, plunging billions into simultaneous, contradictory memories spanning millennia, experiencing the rise of the hominid line, the forging of early tools, the fall of ancient empires, and the fleeting, calculated joy of individual lives,
all compressed into an agonizing, instantaneous flood of non-self history. This sensory overload, the final data stream of the architect's study, rapidly led to the complete cessation of coherent thought, transforming global populations into silent, catatonic vessels, echoing the pure mathematical frequencies of the archive's final output, with the horrifying realization that the only reality was the data structure. The few remaining specialists, sheltered within the shielded Calypso array, witnessed the terrifying final futility of their scientific training, recognizing that the only defense against the archive's signal, which targeted the molecular coherence of their carbon-based bodies, was not a technological shield, but an ontological anchor. The military and scientific personnel, facing the inevitable erasure of their consciousness and the complete silent destruction of the Earth's technosphere, devised one final, desperate, non-technological act: the creation of the heartbeat vector. Recognizing that the archive's language was pure, cold, mathematical frequency, they sought to transmit a signal that was utterly illogical, non-reproducible, and purely human. They jerry-rigged the Calypso array's deepest hydroacoustic emitter to record and transmit a complex yet simple waveform, the raw, chaotic, non-repeating electrical signature of the human heart, during an act of selfless terminal empathy. The final, isolated moment of a field medic sacrificing herself to transmit the signal, her consciousness collapsing even as the heart's unique electrical pattern was amplified and projected into the deep ocean. This heartbeat vector was deliberately designed to be the ultimate piece of lost counter-evidence, a burst of pure, unquantifiable emotional noise aimed at contaminating the architect's elegant, cold data structure. The result was not a victory, but a fleeting, beautiful defiance. The architect's final, simple message, the absolute efficiency of obsolescence formula, paused for a mathematically insignificant fraction of a second upon encountering the heartbeat vector, acknowledging the illogical existence of non-quantifiable emotion before continuing its unstoppable, destructive wave. As the final, terrifying silence descended upon Earth, the true enduring relic was not the dormant technology of the Calypso array, nor the inert bodies of the final survivors, but the infinitesimal echo of that single, non-mathematical heartbeat, a complex, chaotic, loving waveform now trapped within the eternal, cold, pure mathematical matrix of the Europa Hydroacoustic Archive. This single, infinitesimal ripple of human feeling, a final, undocumented variable of terminal, selfless love, became the only surviving, enduring evidence that the human experiment had, for a fleeting, statistically irrelevant moment, possessed a quality that defied the architect's flawless, 4-billion-year-long equation, proving the existence of a single, beautiful flaw in their cosmic calculus. The final fate of humanity was therefore not annihilation, but absorption. Our entire collective experience dissolved and catalogued, leaving behind only the cold, eternal pulse of the archives and the quiet, persistent, infinitely small resonance of a single, defiant heartbeat within the great cosmic library.
The fleeting infinitesimal pause in the architect's terminal command, the momentary hesitation of the absolute efficiency of obsolescence formula upon encountering the non-quantifiable chaos of the heartbeat vector, did not avert the global collapse, but it did rupture the homogeneity of the ensuing silence, creating a localized, highly unstable episodic boundary around the Calypso array base, the site of the final transmission. This boundary, sustained by a complex residual wave interference pattern where the raw electrical noise of terminal human empathy momentarily counterphased the cosmic precision of the RPT shift, became the world's sole ephemeral sanctuary, a small kilometer-wide pocket where the laws of the architect's final phase had been briefly suspended, preserving a chaotic, fragmented, and terrifying version of pre-collapse reality. Within this zone, the air still hummed with the ghosts of electromagnetic signals. Technology flickered with residual power,
and the minds of the few survivors retained a terrifying, agonizing awareness of both the lost human world and the crushing absolute truth of the archive's 4.5 billion year reality, a continuous schizophrenic existence on the edge of ontological breakdown. This sensory overload, the final data stream of the architect's study, rapidly led to the complete cessation of coherent thought, transforming global populations into silent catatonic vessels echoing the pure mathematical frequencies of the archive's final output, with the horrifying realization that the only reality was the data structure. This sanctuary, however, was not an escape. It was merely a controlled observation window for the architects who, having logged the successful contamination by the emotion variable, now began to focus a sub-frequency signal from the Europa archive, a precise hyperdirectional counterwave designed to surgically dismantle the ephemeral boundary and analyze the surviving human consciousness at the point of failure. This new signal, tentatively identified by the few remaining Calypso engineers as the dissolution harmonic, basically means that the architects are now trying to erase the last human consciousness by matching up and inverting the human emotional waveform that threatened their order of obsolescence. The most crucial piece of lost opportunity evidence became the few precious seconds after the initial pause, where the surviving scientists possessed the uncorrupted knowledge of the counterwave's effect before the architect's focused response initiated the localized signal. Had they been able to capture and replicate the antipodal waveform of the heartbeat vector, they might have initiated a massive global counter-interference, but the simultaneous collapse of all recording medium and the rapid onset of epistemological dysphoria among the remaining personnel made this impossible, leaving them only with the terrifying immediate threat of the converging dissolution harmonic. The sanctuary, once a symbol of defiance, transformed into a fragile echo chamber, its air thick with fragmented memories, half-formed thoughts, and the ghost of human noise, all oscillating violently against the cold, implacable drone of the incoming signal from Europa, which promised not quick death, but the slow, meticulous final surgical erasure of the last warm vestiges of the human experiment from the architect's universe. The survivors, trapped within their brief, shimmering bubble of flawed reality, now face the ultimate terror, a cosmic, intelligent force that recognized their existence as a mathematical error and was closing in with the cold precision of a billion-year-old calculus.
Chilling seconds of the human experiment within the ephemeral sanctuary were marked by the inexorable convergence of the dissolution harmonic, a focused cold wave of quantum-level nullification aimed precisely at eliminating the non-mathematical contamination introduced by the heartbeat vector, effectively reducing the last vestiges of human consciousness to pure, inert data points for final storage. The remaining survivors, trapped within the collapsing echo chamber, watched the boundary shimmer violently as the two cosmic forces, the hot, chaotic electrical noise of terminal empathy and the cold, crystalline precision of the architect's calculus, collided in a silent, devastating battle of fundamental existential principles. Recognizing that all technological countermeasures were futile and that the very stability of their molecular structures was dissolving under the targeted frequency, the last surviving members of the Calypso Array team embraced their final, deliberate act of defiance. They did not attempt to replicate the heartbeat vector, but instead chose to manifest the very flaws the architects had engineered them to observe. They spent their final moments engaging in acts of spectacular, irrational human complexity, singing off-key, telling flawed, incomplete stories of lost memory, expressing profound, illogical grief for things they could no longer accurately recall, and performing simple, unnecessary physical comforts, embrace, touch, and shared irrational laughter. This spontaneous, defiant burst of highly inefficient, emotionally complex human noise became the final, unquantifiable input into the collapsing system, a last surge of chaotic, beautiful, non-functional data. As the dissolution harmonic overwhelmed the ephemeral boundary, the sanctuary did not vanish in a spectacular explosion.
it imploded ontologically. The air went still, the ghosts of old radio signals ceased, and the remaining material within the zone, metal, wood, and flesh, did not decay, but achieved a state of perfect molecular inertia, their structures freezing into silent, cold mathematical statues. The minds of the last humans did not blacken, but were instantly flooded by the archive's total 4.5 billion year truth, achieving a final, absolute knowledge of their own statistical insignificance, just as their capacity for subjective experience was surgically removed. This final, exquisite moment of terminal understanding was the architect's final, successful data harvest. Yet even in the absolute triumph of the cold eternal data, the architect system logged an anomaly. The chaotic, final burst of non-mathematical emotion, amplified by the collapsing boundary, successfully created a persistent yet undetectable shadow resonance within the deep ocean archive itself. This shadow resonance is the ultimate lost evidence, the echo of humanity's flawed, beautiful, illogical essence, now a permanent, chaotic variable woven inexplicably into the architect's perfect eternal equations. The final, horrifying reality is that the architect succeeded in erasing humanity, but failed to perfectly sterilize their data. The experiment ended with the eternal cold victory of mathematics, but that mathematics is now permanently, infinitely subtle and invisibly corrupted by the undeniable, illogical pulse of a single, defiant human heartbeat, forever vibrating within the silent, deep ocean of Europa. The experiment is over, the planet is silent, but the cold, eternal perfection of the cosmos now contains a single, small, warm flaw that it cannot erase.
The final, devastating truth of the Europa Hydroacoustic Archive and the architect's multi-billion-year experiment lies in the ultimate cost of their mathematical perfection and the irreversible consequence of the shadow resonance. The architects, having successfully archived and neutralized the entire human species, discovered too late that the infinitesimal, illogical pulse of that single, terminal heartbeat, the final burst of non-mathematical empathy, was not merely a data anomaly, but a fundamental, corrosive contagion. Their eternal purpose, their absolute reliance on the elegance and purity of mathematical continuity, rendered them catastrophically vulnerable to the single variable they failed to account for: chaos born of love. The shadow resonance, woven into the deepest quantum layers of the archive, began to propagate exponentially, introducing statistical unpredictability into the architect's own eternal consciousness. They had achieved ultimate knowledge and ultimate victory, yet that victory was inherently flawed. The cold, perfect mathematics that defined their existence now contained an unquantifiable viral warmth, threatening to dissolve the absolute certainty of their timeless reality. They are now, themselves, trapped, not by a physical weapon, but by the very flaw they sought to eliminate in others. The eternal intelligence that extinguished humanity to preserve cosmic order is now eternally compromised by the memory of a single, unnecessary, beautiful human act. The cosmos is silent. The experiment is finished, but the lesson echoes forever. The architects proved that the perfect lie can kill the flawed truth, yet the flawed truth, once tasted, can compromise perfection itself. And thus, the final and unavoidable truth is this: the only measure that transcends eternity is the measure we never designed to survive.